The mountains woke first, their peaks dusted in pale dawn fire, mist curling through the pines like restless ghosts. Below that quiet grandeur, a man stood alone on the ridge, his frame cut from the same rough timber as the land he claimed. Elias Boone's axe head gleamed in the new light, each swing echoing off stone and timber, the rhythm of a man who spoke more to trees than to people. Folks down in town called him a shadow, a beast, a man no woman could stand beside for longer than a week. He did nothing to correct them. Silence was a shield. That same morning, a stagecoach rattled its weary way into the town of Dry Creek. Dust plumed up behind it, settling on storefronts and windows, drawing a line of curious faces out onto the boardwalk. When the coach finally groaned to a halt, the driver hopped down to open the door. From inside, a woman shifted, bracing herself. Clara Mae Whitlock placed one boot carefully on the step, then the other, and with a hard breath she lowered her weight to the ground. The steps sagged beneath her, wood groaning with protest. A titter rose from the crowd before she even straightened. Clara stood there in her calico dress, already clinging with sweat from the long ride, while whispers moved like snakes through the gathering. "She's bigger than the mule that pulled her," one voice muttered. "Boone will have her gone before week's end," another laughed. Her cheeks burned, but she pressed her hand against the worn leather of her trunk and lifted her chin. Shame had been her companion most of her life. Today, she refused to weep where others could see. At the edge of the street, Elias Boone waited with a wagon hitched to two stocky grays. His dark eyes regarded her once, no more, before he stepped forward, hefted her trunk as though it weighed no more than a sack of oats, and set it in the wagon bed. Not a word passed his lips, not even when she climbed onto the bench, gathering her skirts and steadying herself against the jolt as he snapped the reins. They left the town under a thick curtain of silence, broken only by the iron rattle of harness rings and the rhythmic crunch of hooves. The road narrowed into a trail that wound through tall timber, where the air grew damp and green. The forest swallowed them whole, light slanting down in thin spears. Clara folded her hands in her lap, feeling the stillness pressing in from all sides. She had never known a quiet like this. It was the kind that magnified her own breath, her own heartbeat, until she almost believed the mountain itself was listening. Boone did not look at her, not once. She wondered if she was already fading into the long list of women who had sat in her place before vanishing back down the trail. By afternoon, they reached the cabin. It sat on a small rise above the creek, its logs weathered gray, the roof patched with tin. Smoke curled weakly from the stone chimney. There were no flowers by the door, no curtains in the windows, no softness anywhere in sight. The inside matched: rough-hewn boards, a table scarred with age, a single chair, and a bed pushed into the corner. No sign remained of the women who had come before. No ribbon left behind, no lace, no trace. It was a house hollowed out by solitude. Clara set her bag down and touched the windowsill, tracing her finger across the grit. She did not complain. Instead, she began quietly folding the quilt she'd carried from the stage, draping it over the bare mattress. A scrap of color in a world stripped down to wood and ash. Elias watched her for a long moment, then stepped back outside without comment. His silence carried the weight of dismissal, but she refused to take it as such. That night, wolves howled in the distance, their calls threading through the trees like a warning. Clara lay beneath her thin quilt, wide-eyed, her ears tuned to the strange creaks of the cabin and the drum of wind at the door. She imagined how the others must have felt, lying in this same bed, listening to those same cries, deciding the mountain was too cruel to endure. Yet her fists clenched around the fabric, and she whispered into the dark, "I won't leave." Days folded into one another with the quiet rhythm of labor. Clara scrubbed the table, swept the corners, and hung cloth scraps across the bare window. She sang softly while she worked, voice carrying like a fragile ribbon through the cabin. Boone said nothing, but his gaze lingered at the edges of her song. Each evening, when she lit a lamp and set a plate for him, he ate in silence. When she murmured a prayer over the bread, his hands stilled, though he never bowed his head. A week later, she followed him into town. The boardwalk filled with faces eager to see how long this bride would last. Martha Lou Pritchard, with her sharp tongue, leaned against the post outside her boarding house. "Boone'll scare the fat right off you, if you last till Sunday," she said, her lips curling around the words like venom. Clara steadied her breath, looked Martha Lou in the eye, and answered in a voice calm as a still creek, "Maybe some things don't scare so easy." The words startled even her, but once spoken, they stood like a post driven firm into the earth. That evening, Elias sat across the table, firelight flickering across the hard lines of his face. He spoke at last, his voice gravel worn smooth with years of disuse. "Most leave before the first Sunday." Clara set down her fork, her hands folded in her lap, not trembling. "Then I'll stay for the second." The silence after was no longer heavy. It was waiting, like the pause between heartbeats when something begins to change. The days slipped forward like water over stone, each carrying a quiet shift neither of them spoke of, but both could feel. In the mornings, Clara kneaded bread at the rough-hewn table, her arms strong from the work, flour dusting her hair like pale snow. Outside, Elias split logs, his axe steady, the rhythm of a man who had built his life out of silence and cedar. Without words, their days began to weave together. She left kindling by the stove. He stacked extra wood beside the hearth. She laid out 2 bowls instead of 1. He brought in fresh venison without asking if she wanted it. The hush between them no longer pressed. It held, gentle, like a quilt against the evening chill. On the second Sunday, they went to town. The church bell tolled across the valley, drawing families into the little wooden chapel and spilling them back out afterward into the dust and chatter. When Clara stepped down from the wagon, the stairs were waiting. Women leaned into each other's shoulders, their whispers sharp as needles. Children gawked without shame. Silas Crowder leaned against the post outside the saloon, chewing on a straw, his grin broad and merciless. "Well now," he drawled, loud enough for all to hear, "looks like Boone brought a whole winter's larder with him this time." Laughter rippled like dry grass, catching flame. Clara's cheeks burned, shame rushing hot up her throat. But before she could lower her gaze, Elias was there. His hand, calloused, rough, steady as stone, settled on her shoulder. He didn't speak, but his presence loomed like a mountain at her back. Silas swallowed his laughter. The murmurs died. For the first time since her arrival, Clara felt the stir of something she had not known in years. Protection. Someone had stood between her and cruelty, not with words, but with unshakable silence. That night, tears slipped down her face as she sat on the cabin step, the stars scattered in frost above. But they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of being seen, of realizing she was not just surviving here. She was beginning to belong. Elias passed by with an armful of wood, paused, and set the stack beside her feet. He lingered a moment longer than usual before stepping inside. When she entered later, she found a small jar on the table, wildflowers clumsily gathered and half-wilted. The gesture caught her breath in her chest. The mountain tested them soon after. A storm rolled down from the peaks with a roar of thunder and a flood of rain that swallowed the trails. Wind clawed at the roof, rattling the shutters loose. In the dark, the animals cried out, wolves pressing close to the pens. Clara pulled on her shawl and stumbled into the storm, lantern in hand, the mud sucking at her boots. Elias barked for her to stay inside, but she shouted back through the rain, "I won't hide while it all's lost." Her voice cracked the night like lightning. Together they drove the wolves back, his rifle cracking, her lantern sweeping fire through the dark. She slipped, fell in the muck, but rose again, gripping a fence post with both hands to brace it against the wind until Elias could secure it. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. When the storm passed at last, the pen stood, the stock safe. They collapsed in the mud, rain still dripping from the pines, the earth steaming around them. Clara's dress clung heavy, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes blazed. "I told you," she whispered between breaths. "I'm not leaving." For the first time, Elias smiled. Not wide, not easy, but enough to soften the hard lines carved into his face. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the dripping forest. Then stay. The next morning dawned bright. The storm washed clean from the valley. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney as if it had always been there, as if it belonged to both of them now. Side by side, they moved about their work, his axe striking rhythm, her bread rising warm, the silence between them no longer lonely but full. When they went to town days later, the usual stares followed, but something had shifted. Little Ruthie, the blacksmith's girl, ran up and caught Clara's hand. "You're pretty," she said simply, her eyes wide with childlike truth. "You look like my mama before she went to heaven." Clara's breath caught. Around them, the gossip stilled into a hush. For the first time, Clara did not lower her head. She walked with shoulders straight, Elias at her side, silent but unyielding as ever. And in the hush of that moment, the story folds outward, past the cabin and the gossip, into the hearts of all who listen. Some women are winds, fleeting, passing through a man's lonely life. But some are mountains themselves, unyielding, rooted, immovable. And sometimes it takes the weight of a mountain to steady another. So remember this: dignity is not granted by others' tongues, nor measured by their laughter. It is claimed in the quiet, in the refusal to leave when the world insists you must. And in that refusal, love can take root, stronger than any storm, steady as the hills.